Hello everyone, it's Greg from Edinburgh Renaissance Fencing Academy here, and today I am presenting part 2 in my short series on the rapier fencing system of Ridolfo Capoferro. It's an Italian system from the early 17th century. Part 1 in this series looked at body posture or stance, and today we're going to build on that by looking at movement, or in other words, footwork. I'll summarise the footwork with an empty hand, and I recommend you try to follow along with what I'm doing, also with an empty hand to start with. And then once you've assimilated the basics, you can start to replicate all the exercises with sword in hand at that point. So I'm going to put my weapon down to the side, and then I will summarise the footwork as succinctly as I can. Before I start talking about the footwork, just a super quick reminder about posture. In Capoferro's system, the terza guardia, which is the third guard or third posture in his system, is considered to be the default stance. It's the most defensive guard and therefore the most secure one to stand in. So basically it's recommended you start a fencing bout in that stance, and therefore we're going to look at all this basic footwork stuff in terza guardia only. We'll return to the other stances such as seconda and quarta in subsequent videos when they are tactically relevant. Okay, so terza guardia, remember, is a defensive stance like this. The weight is held on the back leg and the torso is moved over the rear thigh, and the sword held loosely and centrally in front of us to present a threat and an obstacle to the opponent. So your stance should look something like this. So the first thing when you're going to practice the footwork is just take a few moments to settle into the stance and make sure you feel as comfortable as possible in it. Okay, so footwork. There are basically two types of footwork within Capoferro's system. On the one hand, we have a rather loose and only vaguely defined set of steps which we use when we are outside of measure. For example, at the start of a bout. And these are the steps that you use to move around, to size up your opponent, to assess the situation, maybe to look for an angle to approach which is favourable for yourself, and so on and so forth. Once you close in to fencing measure, or to almost fencing measure, you need to switch modes and start using a much tighter and more cautious system of footwork. So let's start off outside of measure in our terza guardia stance. So with your weight loaded on the back hip like this, you will find that the easiest way to move quickly is with a gathering step, which is where, if I want to go forwards, the back foot closes in next to the front foot or close to the front foot, and then the front foot extends forwards to return to our stance. And going backwards, it's the exact opposite. We gather the front foot back near the rear foot and then extend the rear foot to return to stance. These steps should be quite easy, quite natural to do. They don't need to be linear. They can also circle around or move in an angulated fashion. For example, if I'm heading right, like so, or left, like so, going backwards to the right, and maybe to the left, straight forwards, straight backwards. So the first exercise is just to practice moving around like that. Keep it nice and loose, keep it nice and relaxed. Maybe imagine there's a sort of circular arena in the space where you're training, and just practice moving around like so. The most important principle to remember is that you must hold your weight steady while you do this. That means that your waist, your vita in Italian, and the hips which support it Remain as close to being perfectly level as possible. Do not bounce or bob up and down. This is very inefficient and a little bit unstable. Also, make sure you keep your weight held over the back leg. This means that you are loaded, so to speak, and prepared for fencing movements when the action actually starts, for attacks, for parries, for avoidances, etc. So, when we're moving, keeping our weight back here and as close to flat as possible. So once you've got comfortable with those steps, you can switch mode to the steps we use when we're close in, when we're at measure, when we're ready to begin interacting. And these steps actually look essentially the same as more modern styles of fencing. I'll use modern terminology for them. The steps are basically the advancing step or advance and the retreating step or retreat. And they're kind of the opposite of the gathering steps. So if I'm facing this way and I want to move forwards, I move the front foot first, just a little bit. And then I bring the back foot up to resume my stance. So advance. And then retreating, it's the opposite. I move the back leg first, reaching out with it, like so, and then pull the front foot back and retreat again. So when I move around like this, these steps are small, therefore making small adjustments in the measure. You should step to a maximum of about 1 foot length, but if necessary, a half foot length is perfectly acceptable for this sort of adjusting step. Facing the camera, advance, 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 and then retreat, retreat, retreat. And I should follow the same principles as with the wider measure steps, trying to keep my hips as level as possible and my weight shifted back. So practice moving around in this manner and trying to hold your weight as steady as possible. There may be some minor variations because you're moving. That's fine, but minimize them. Keep them small. And don't forget to keep your sword arm relaxed as well. Once you're comfortable with the two styles of moving, just practice mixing them up a little bit. Again, just imagine a roughly circular space in whichever area you're training in, like a little arena, and just practice moving around. Moving around quickly and non-linearly, and then put in some retreats, some advances, some quick retreats, some maneuvering around, advancing, retreating, quickly moving forwards, advancing, advancing, retreating, 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 etc. So you should notice that those gathering steps are very easy to do and they allow you kind of free roaming movement. However, the advancing and retreating steps are much more linear, they're much more cautious, and they also allow you to maintain a kind of tighter defense with your sword, which is why we use them when we're actually closing into fencing measure. So the last piece of the puzzle is to pick up your sword. If you don't have a sword available, just find a suitably heavy stick of approximately the right length. It'll give you a good enough feel for it. And practice moving around in stance. Remember, the sword is partially extended. Do not extend it out here. This will tire your arm, it means the sword doesn't have much power in it. It's easy for the opponent to defeat out there. And don't fully withdraw your guard either. This is also, in Capoferro's system, inefficient. Okay, it's constrained and it's not really presenting much of that threat to the opponent. So in his system, a partially extended sword like this is what we want. But the weight of the sword, as much as possible, is being borne by the core muscles around the vita, around the waist. So finally, you just practice moving around sword in hand and mix up the steps. Advancing, advancing, retreating, retreating, maneuvering quickly, advancing, retreating quickly, maneuvering around, advancing, advancing, retreating quickly, advancing, maneuvering, advancing, retreating, maneuvering, advance, advance, retreat, retreat, etc., etc. Okay, so I would encourage you to improvise with the steps. So that's basically it for today. It's a super short summary, but the most important ideas are when you move around, you have to keep your weight on your back leg, and there are two modes of movement: a very kind of loose, relaxed way of moving around when you're outside of measure, looking for an opening, and then a much tighter, more linear, more cautious approach when you're actually crossing the threshold into fencing measure, ready to interact and begin the exchange. Hopefully that makes sense. It's noticeably different from the earlier 16th century systems. So Capoferro is in some ways making a clean break from the past and kind of focusing his system into a much more linear approach to using the rapier. So I'll finish there for today. Next time we'll take a little look at preparing to attack and some of the subtleties of handling the sword. Until then, take care. See you next time.